Okay, so welcome to the inaugural, the first ever Community Campfire. If you're watching us live, watching us back, thanks for joining us, and hello to my co-facilitator and space holder of the day, Shahana. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Gary. I'm so excited. Our first community campfire. We finally kicked off. Thank you.
Not at all. Thank you for being open to be part of this exploration. So before we bring Paul on, and hopefully Sarah will be able to join us as well, would you mind setting the scene a little bit, Shahana? We've had quite some dialogue over the past months, and as we were talking about before we went live, it really feels the time is it's really critical now that we step into this dialogue. And I'd love for you maybe to set the scene today as to where we're going to be exploring, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Gary. And I'll try to be as succinct as possible, given our many dialogues from the past few months. So, here is a little bit of the context for the community campfire on the whole and today's conversation as well. In the face of planetary collapse, organizations, I believe, have unique roles to play. Unshackled from the old machine metaphor, organizations are living systems, spaces for thriving and flourishing. They are imaginal cells carrying the codes of metamorphosis. Such organizations that dare to break free of the matrix become weavers and wayfinders of planetary healing, nodes of emergent future possibilities. As heralds of the new narratives, how would organizations function? What would such organizations feel like? And what would be the operating principles, the new OS, so to speak? These are some of our explorations for today and going forward in the future. So, welcome everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Gary.
Thanks for setting that up so beautifully, Shahana. You could find Shahana's details at the bottom of the live. Let's bring Paul on. Looks like we're still, hopefully Sarah will be able to join us, but let's bring Mr. McCarthy into the mix. Paul, welcome to the Community Campfire today. How are you?
Wonderful. Gary and Sahana, really good to be here. I know we chatted backstage and we've had these conversations. The tentacles have been kind of moving through the narratives we've all been having globally with our work. So really pleased to have this conversation. And so thrilled that we're doing it on Independence Day. So thrilled that we're doing it on July the 4th. The irony is not lost on me.
Yeah, and I would go further than say the irony, and maybe the design is actually is the thing, right?
Mm,
Because a bit of context for everyone watching or listening back is Paul and I were originally due to do a right here, right now live stream today, and Paul put out a wonderful, positive yet provocative article last week, and we just said, hey, how do we actually just bring more people into this dialogue? It's not about being right, it's about the many different lenses, the many different threads that we can weave together to try and imagine something beyond growth at all costs, extractivism, the harm that does get caused, unfortunately, in many parts of the systems as they operate today. So maybe you just want to set a little bit of a scene, Paul, what that article
mm.
was, and then maybe we can go to do a bit of an opening round between the three of us as to where we're at as part of what you shared.
Yeah, I'd love to. And disclaimer and caveat: people listening to that are still inside the matrix and haven't yet woken up or are awakening, but find this painful. That's your ego, and that's what's preventing us from moving forward. So, without further ado, what I did was basically I saw an article from McKinsey that was talking about uncaring leadership as one of the top reasons employees are leaving organizations in this new world that we're living in, which, by the way, spoiler alert, isn't a new world at all, but COVID has accelerated the work that we're doing in this world to make it look new. So this great resignation, great reimagination, whatever you want to call it, is leading to people leaving organizations. And they're saying they're leaving in droves because of people, leaders that aren't very caring and empathetic and compassionate. So my post was in response to that saying, what about if we've missed the point? And what about if we've designed our organizations in a way where we are all complicit in being part of something that is beyond our control. And in fact, let's bring some compassionate empathy and disruption into the fact that these uncaring leaders may in fact also just be playing a role inside this system, and they feel that they need to blindly accept the hierarchy, the systems, the narrative in order to advance in their roles. And so it's kind of, for me anyway, it's got quite a lot of views so far. I think we're at 10,000 so far. And we've had a number of reshares. We've had a number of really insightful intellectual comments. And it underpins the fact that I think it's time for us to have this conversation about changing and evolving the narrative about what our organizations are going to be looking like in the future. So that was the context. And I know, Gary, you and I have also been on Twitter, and we were chatting about similar things a few months ago. And ironically, the group that we were chatting about this kind of subject with were also in the matrix, but they were on the leadership practitioner side. So they were the people providing leadership training to organizations. But they're all a bunch of old white guys who are kind of in the systemic conversation of, we can't change our narrative because we can't bite the hand that feeds us. And so I know Gary and I controversially tried to kind of have conversations with them, maybe more me, you know, at the beginning, because I was trying to see if there's a real groundswell and appetite. But it seems to me there's a contradiction on both sides, on the organization side and also on the practitioner side, who talk a good game and they throw peanuts from the cheap seats, but they're not really getting on the ground in the arena to shape this narrative. So I think there's some tenets of my conversations that I've been having that we could go anywhere we want with this.
Yeah, I love. Thank you, Paul, for that. And I'm just going to chip in before finishing the round with Sahana after her wonderful introduction. I just want to pick up on what you just shared, which is really important, and it's a space that I haven't always been in the last few years. A deep compassion for those that are stuck in the matrix, which is all of us, right? We're all part of it. We've been conditioned to believe it is the only way. But we're now realizing, oh my God, everything's so interconnected, everything's so interdependent. Biodiversity loss is a problem, water access is a problem. So there's this massive awareness shift at the same time as almost widespread paralysis of what can I do from my spot. And I think this conversation for me is an invitation, despite the complexities that are going on. And in fact, Sahana, I'd love to come to you, because of, and maybe through the complexities, is the opportunity, right? To hold these seemingly competing perspectives, these seemingly difficult challenges in each hand, and not just going down on one is right and one is wrong is part of the opportunity, I feel. But I'll hand it over to you, Sahana, maybe before we go into a bit more of a free flow. How's this landing with you so far with what Paul shared and my little addition so far as we go journeying today?
Thanks, Gary and Paul. What Paul shared resonates so strongly with me. And as you know, Gary, for the last 3-4 years, I've been writing about this leadership, current leadership, being a construct. It's a construct of the organizational narrative, the Ivy League MBA schools, and we've produced generations of leaders who have been forced to leave their humanity behind, who have been forced and trapped into this narrative and have been forced to leave their humanity behind and adopt the so-called mantle of leadership equals being ruthless, being competitive, being strategic, whatever that means, and being, everything that strips one of one's innate empathy and humanity and vulnerability and just being oneself. So leaders today, I believe, have become this object, this construct, who really don't know who they are. They have to abide by certain paradigms. So yes, I actually have deep compassion and an almost, burning desire to be parts of these conversations that we're currently having. Like Paul said, there are many such conversations happening across the globe today, and high time they did happen. And what you said, Gary, about the complexities and the pluriversal nature of the complexities and the interconnectedness, the interrelatedness. We have landed ourselves in this mess because we are all collectively being driven by a homogeneous narrative in an essentially diverse pluriversal planet. A single narrative running the show for centuries, created by a handful of, excuse me, but a handful of white men, have run their course. They've done whatever, some good things, some very bad things, but they have run their course. It's time to gracefully hospice what we no longer need, to create space for what must come, what has to happen. And for that, we need to collectively, no longer a homogeneous narrative was never meant to work for everyone. It cannot. There cannot be a single narrative running the show in an essentially extremely diverse, beyond human, more than human planet. So, in an interconnected, interrelated, a very sentient planet, what are those collective narratives that we can collectively co create? Like Paul said, these conversations are increasingly becoming not only essential, they are like as important, as essential as breathing, as air, because they are going to be seeds of the future that we may never see, but we have to plant the seeds. Some of those will take root, some of those might be eaten up by birds, some of those might just fall on stony ground and never ever flourish. But then the seeds have to be, dispersed far and wide and as frequently as we can. I don't know if that makes sense, but
It's stunning, Shahana. What I'd love to add to this, because what we want to try and do with these campfire conversations, is we do want to talk about theory. We want to talk about where we're at contextually, but we also want to be super practical, right? So, what are the steps that you can take to try and help co-create if you're watching or you're listening? And I want to put something straight into the space today. One, if you can bring yourself, human being, wherever you are, whatever company, wherever you sit in the world, to stay super curious. When someone tells you something works a certain way, remember what it was like to be a 3-4-year-old kid going, why? Or do you mind explaining or clarifying exactly why that is the case today? That's one really simple little way, a little seed, just to go to the system. Hey, do we really need to keep doing it this way? Right. So what I'd like to invite us to do as well, Shahana and Paul, as we go round, is let's remember to try and drop in the practical seeds as we journey today as well. That'd be really, really helpful. So what I'd love to do at this stage is just, let's go free flow. But maybe Paul, if you've got any you've been doing so much work with thousands of leaders over the years, like Shahana has. What are some of the most common challenges maybe around the old world? And what are some of the practical steps people can start to do to try and co-create some new narratives, in your opinion?
And Sahana, I think a lot of what you've just said there is resonates with me in terms of the conversations that I'm having, as well as the philosophies that I'm putting out there in my work. And I just wrote something down here when you were talking about the narrative, the homogenous narrative needs to change. I've got here, we need to create the space for diverse narratives to coexist, because it's not like we just replace one homogenous narrative with another leading narrative of the day. It's how do we step back, get curious, to Gary's point, and actually have 5 or 6 narratives coexisting concurrently, because that's how we learn from each other. And I'm just going to bring this point about curiosity in Gary as well, because the research that I've done for my first book in terms of leadership of the future, and all the trends and the statistics show us that curiosity, I call it inquisitive nature, but Francesca Gino from Harvard calls it the business case of curiosity. That is going to be a fundamental trait or attribute for future leaders. Now, if we now overlay that onto this conversation, without that curiosity as a leader, in fact, as a human, we will not be able to create the space to have concurrent narratives coexisting. So for me, getting practical on that side, one of the things I do with leadership teams, in context of in a corporate environment, is to say, how do you create that space? So what are the things that you're, the elephant in the room? What are the things you're not talking about that you say you don't have you say you've got an open door policy, but your actions demonstrate otherwise. You have a closed door meeting after the meeting ends, but certain people aren't invited to it. What does that show about the narrative you're pushing forward in the organization? So how can you stop those things? And I do an exercise with leadership and leadership teams where I say, start, stop, change, continue. So look at yourselves in a goldfish bowl as a leader or leadership team, and you want this new vision, this new narrative. But what are the things that you need to start doing, stop doing, continue doing, or change doing? And how are you going to measure those and keep yourself accountable to making sure that you're adhering to those agreements? But that's one of the things I do. And one of the other things, and I'll pause for a reflection and build on that, is, and I've said this in a few podcasts as well, is around name what you see moments. And that quite simply is name what you see. And for anyone in the UK, the game of catchphrase that was hosted by Roy Walker many years ago, 9 squares, 60 seconds, 1 square gets taken away each second until you have a catchphrase revealed, and your job is to guess the catchphrase. So in the same sense, I've applied that to develop a tool for leaders and leadership teams to say, if you're in a meeting, if you're in an environment and you're kicking off the project or whatever you're doing, and you see some toxic behavior, dysfunctional behavior, siloed behavior, politicking, call it out with your leaders, with your leadership team. Put it in the middle of the room, take the blame off, take the ego away, take the emotion out, and just get curious about that and have a round robin. And then you each do that as leaders in your leadership team. And then you start to think, well, how can we address that? And that's where we do the start, stop, change, continue. And so they're very real things you can do right now as leaders watching this, leadership teams watching this, to drastically improve your morale, your productivity, and your engagement. Right now, you can do that right now. It costs nothing.
Yeah.
I love these moments of inflection, these pauses. What's coming up for you, Garry?
To be honest, I'm going to pass it over to Sahana. I just want to acknowledge what just happened. 3 adult human beings allowing a space without it needing to be filled. That is also a practice ground. I just wanted to name what I saw in that moment. An experience. It's a really important part, I think, of allowing stuff to emerge, to let that wisdom, to let people be seen, particularly in different contexts and different environments. It's okay to let that space exist when nothing's happening. Sahana, I'd love to know what's coming up for you following Paul's shares.
Could I share something just before Sahana says something, just about, in the spirit of being transparent and vulnerable and everything we all are? I had a moment of discomfort in that silence just then, but I also had a moment of, I'm finally being seen. And I wondered if the discomfort was because we're going at 1,000,000 miles an hour, all these social platforms, all these expectations, and we've just got to move on with something. And so I just want to acknowledge I felt a little bit pulled there, because I'm human too, right? So, Sahana.
Thank you. And Paul, Garry, when Garry said to stay with the silence, I felt curiously at peace. And I guess, I don't know if this is an east-west thing, but I'll just say this is perhaps a me thing. Sometimes I find paces of conversation so rapid that I don't know if people are really listening, if people are really, sort of listening from their core. So when there is a pause, when there's a silence, for me that kind of I find it very nourishing in a conversation, and holding space for that silence. And so that's exactly what happened. I just felt, I just kind of felt within what Paul was saying about leaders, about doing a retro with, what needs to change, what needs to continue, and start, stop. And I was thinking of leaders I was rather imagining leaders as facilitators, as stewards, donning the mantle of facilitative leadership. And what would that be like if leaders could become facilitators, holding space for just such conversations, not necessarily with a meeting agenda, but a conversation that is really free flowing, genuinely generative, where such silences are not, no one rushes to fill in the silence. You know what I'm saying? But the silences are also part of that dialogue, of that space holding. How can leaders become such facilitators so that they can have these little community conversations, community campfires within their organizations? Maybe once a week with a team, or once a month with their teams, whatever works. But what would that look like?
Something that's really popping up for me, Sahana and Paul, is, and I'm really excited, I'm getting a real reaction in my head, in the back of my neck, like energetically, because everything we've discussed so far, elements such as leaders as facilitators, staying curious, name what you see, create the space. Every person within every system today can lead that should they choose. There's no £100 million investment. There's no new technology required. Every single one of us can step up and start one of those dialogues, one of those community campfires for themselves in their context today. I find that really exciting.
So can I share what's coming up for me as I feel into this, and I think about taking it to the next level. I love the concept of facilitative leadership, and it's one that I endorse, and it's one that I have seen work very well. It relies and it's predicated on the assumption that the leader can actually hold the space, acknowledge their own ego and their own role and their own self-sabotaging behaviors and their own pressures, and put that into the mix as well. And the reason I say that is because it made me think about the next thing, which was the thing that stops people I've seen is that we do believe we cannot break free from a system that we've inherited, we've been born into. And then I go even more curiously down the rabbit hole with that, and I ask why. And I come back, Sahana and Garry, to the same answer every time. And I do sound like a broken record now in the world because I'm saying the same thing. It's about finding and owning and keeping your voice as a human. Just think about that for a moment. If you spoke from a place of conviction, truly knowing in your own narrative that you are on the right path, I wonder how that could transform our approach to not just humanity, leadership, because for me the two are entwined. You're a human and you're a leader, but on a global scale. No posting on social for clickbait metrics. No posting on social because it was the trendy thing to do, but posting because it was the right thing to do. It was in congruence with your values, you as a person, and your voice. And that became the metric of success.
Thank you, Paul. One phrase came up for me, and it's actually a book I love. I read and reread. Living Divided No More. It's a I love reading Parker Palmer's books, and this is a phrase from his book, and a hidden wholeness. And so, what you said, Paul, just reminded me so strongly of that. I've written about this in the context of leadership earlier, but it just brought everything so alive that if we leaders, when I say we, I think all of us can become leaders. When I say become leaders, not in the sense of power and position, but leading ourselves from within. If we find our own hidden wholeness and can stay with that in the face of extreme provocation, in the face of seemingly implacable narratives and paradoxes, what would that look like? What would such leadership look like? And what would then organizations become? What could organizations then become? And, we all make our path by walking. So, even taking one step on that path. I mean, I know Parker Palmer's book, Let Your Life Speak, made me leave, not leave as in leave, but I left my corporate job. I'm still a part of the organizational world because I want to build this new narrative, be a part of building this new narrative. But I left my corporate job because I felt I was leading paradoxical lives, like two lives, one inside, one outside. This was 6 years ago with one of the largest organizations in the global organizations. But yeah, so if we find our hidden wholeness, what would such leadership look like? And how do we nurture and nourish such leaders? What would the underlying narratives be?
I'm really curious about the metric part that you're combining what you both just shared. There's a phrase, right, in the West, metrics that matter. What are the metrics that matter? At the moment, it's GDP, it's growth, it's stock holding, it's very financially driven in and of itself. So I'm curious as we sit here exploring today, putting my CEO hat on, right? I'm connected to a number of them. I'm sure you both are as well. They've got very busy, high-powered, powerful jobs. What's going to put the handbrake on? Like, what do they need to feel? What experiences do they need to be able to even put a handbrake on, to even think that there could be other metrics that matter outside of growth and GDP and M&A, etc. I just want to put that little seeding, because I think that's a really interesting, an interesting part of this. Is like, what do we invite, some new seeds that we might want to spread or investigate together?
Oh, Garry. So, because a lot of these well-intentioned, in surface value CEOs are wanting the new narrative, and at least this is my experience, and this is what peers and colleagues I'm picking up from as well. They want it, yet they're still trapped in a narrative that still rewards them on ROI and metrics, and making sure you get your P&L aligned per quarter. Right? That's what they're basing their success on. So I found, okay, continue with that narrative, but start to drip feed other things into the conversation. And by other things, I put tangible numbers against these things I'm about to say. Again, anyone that's listening to me on social has heard this so many times. These are out there. All I'm doing is the dot connector. Love what you said earlier, Sahana, about nodes. And what I've been doing in my work is creating the nodes to say, Gallup estimates there's $7 trillion of disengagement. That's what disengagement costs us every year. It's increasing, by the way, CEOs.
Yep.
$400 billion is spent every year on developing leaders, and only 14% of CEOs think that leadership development works. That's another connection. 200 to 400% of your base salary as a leader is the cost that it incurs to replace a leader that leaves an organization that's toxic, has poor morale, low productivity per leader. So when I talk to CEOs, they're my three kind of core tenets of metrics that the old guard CEO understands, because I translate that quite literally into millions of dollars leaving your organization because of your approach to the way you lead. That's then going to impact the morale of the team you leave behind, the productivity of that team. And guess what? The work that you do for your client base. And then guess what? Your clients will leave you. And then guess what? New client acquisition will be tough. And then guess what? You will be in front of your board as a CEO justifying your existence. And then guess what? You'll be on LinkedIn looking for a new CEO role, and you'll start the hamster wheel again. This is what I'm trying to say. We talked about this backstage. Our work may not even germinate change until we're all dead. And I don't care, because if it starts to penetrate and impact the narrative that the traditional, hierarchical approach is having, and the impact it's having on our people, then it's making a difference. So in a roundabout way, Gary, what I'm saying is I'm looking at backdoor ways to get in front of CEOs that are still in the paradigm of the matrix, showing them I'm using their language, showing them metrics, their indisputable metrics. And then they can put that in a spreadsheet, run it, and then come back and tell me this compassionate, empathetic, human-centered stuff, it could be good for business. I'm getting excited now. I was excited before, but I'm getting really excited now.
And in this post-pandemic world, we are not post-pandemic yet, but I'm just using the phrase for the lack of a better word. We have seen disruptions of all kind that we didn't think or we thought would take decades. Those happened over a couple of years, okay? Which means where there is willingness, change can happen. And yes, this was rammed down people's throats. There was no choice. Suddenly everyone had to sort of, withdraw into their wherever and work from home, work from where they could. And obviously I'm talking of a certain kind of workers. Not everyone had the luxury of sitting in front of a laptop and working, but those who did. But the entire paradigms of working and organizations underwent a huge shift. And today's leaders trained in the old school thinking are struggling with teams who are mostly still remote, who are still distributed, who are diverse, and whom they can't see on a regular basis, at least see in flesh and blood, so to speak. So this has led to this, Zoom crisis or whatever, video crisis of constantly having the video on or constantly being in meetings. Now, when we put all of that cost together, cost of lost opportunities, cost of the loss of learning something new out of this disruption, and trying to take this completely new scenario and trying to retrofit the old into the new, trying to go back to the old as rapidly as possible, rather than trying to shift the underlying paradigms. Thinking of that from an OD L&D perspective, and that's the space I've been in for 22 years. I think those are huge loss of learning for organizations, opportunities that they could have translated into completely different ways of being and working. So, how does that add up to this current scenario of loss of disengagement, loss of engagement, what we call the gig economy, actually giving rise to a set of workers with lower and lower and lower, um, not an experience, but commitment to an organization, that organizational connect, if you will. So, on one hand, for the sake of flexibility and productivity and profit and whatever, we have the platform capitalism. On the other, to keep track of them, we have surveillance capitalism. And on top of that, we have algorithms. And on top of that, we have leaders who are completely at a loss of how to make sense of this whole narrative, which is driving them and not they who are driving this whole narrative. So, where does that lead us as organizations? Do we want to become a handful of algorithm-driven, platform-driven human resources, or do we want to have thriving, flourishing, creative, empathetic disruptors as
Mm.
teams and as co-workers and colleagues and leaders?
So good. So good. I want to acknowledge Sarah's unfortunately struggled with the tech today, but she's joining us in the chat, which is
Oh,
wonderful.
brilliant.
So I'm going to share a little bit of what Sarah's been sharing. Before I do that, I just want to add on to this. This for me is the absolute rub. Okay, so there's a narrative piece. What are the stories? What are the narratives? And then there's a capability. So I see these two things are critically important. And what I'm taking away from our exploration so far, and also some of Sarah's chat in the chat box, there's something about embracing where we are and not turning away from where we are. And to embrace it, we need to be deeply human. We need to be listening generatively. We need to be connecting with people that don't look and sound like us. We need to be courageous and take that step without knowing what's going to come next. We need to be vulnerable and truly not need all the answers, right? A lot of the stuff we've all been talking about for several years before the pandemic, but the pandemic has ripped that scar wide back open again and said, look, you cannot survive long term without this interconnectedness, this diversity. You will not be here as a species if you don't wake up and connect and leverage the diversity that we have, right? And that's how I'm really seeing this conversation already for me has just made that so clear that yes, there's a narratives piece and there's an outright capability piece. And the irony, that capability piece is innate. We are all curious, we are all courageous, we are all loving, we are all connected, right? But it's so suppressed under the colonial thinking that we've been conditioned with. And I'm now going to throw Sarah's question into the mix, and it's a brilliant one. Do you believe that leaders currently, although they're hanging on to the security and familiarity, great point of the matrix, do they see and actually feel, and I want to emphasize that point, do they see and actually feel the need for change? And I'm going to add to this, Sarah, great question. Are they in enough pain yet? Is that part of the issue? Does there need to be more pain? I'll throw it into the mix. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm seeing that they are in pain and they are looking for guides to help them through this pain. And there's the guide element to help them navigate those uncharted waters. There's the narrative pressurizing them to continue to be complicit in the matrix. No doubt they're also experiencing their own health challenges, mental health, physical health challenges. No doubt that they're picking up on a lot of these kind of ripple effects that this narrative results in. Now, anyone that knows my work will know that about 2 or 3 years ago, I was much more wanting to throw the grenade of disruption into the middle of the room and blow up the system. And now anyone that knows me, Gary included, kudos to you, my friend, knows that I've gone through my own journey of becoming awake aware, awake, having the courage to do something, evolving into this space, and now embodying everything I'm talking about. And so I see the need where CEOs are, and I'll just broaden it to kind of senior leadership in general. And in fact, let's broaden it further. Everybody that is in the matrix and knows that they're in the matrix, they will go through one of those stages, those 5 stages I've just outlined. I started 2-3 years ago from a place of, I have to say, from a place of judgment. And through my own journey, I've said, you know what, we're all part of this. So I'm now showing through my understanding of where they're at that I feel your pain. I said in my post to advertise this session, I see you. I feel your pain. I feel your fear. All of the pieces are here when you're ready. But in the saying in the UK, Gary, that we have, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. In that context, there needs to be more pain to the part that you asked, Gary, like what will make them change. There needs to be more pain, I think, in the form of turnover, in the form of morale dropping. And again, this is all narrative. This is language for the traditional narrative. But I'm going to throw something else into the mix, and maybe we see what it kind of conjures up here, because this is what I am. I wonder whether to realize this future set of narratives, we need to normalize disruption instead of normalizing dysfunction. And what I mean is disruption as a leadership quality, in fact, as a quality, needs to be looked for in the way we identify, recruit, onboard, and develop talent. Because I firmly believe that disruptors are the future of work. They are the future innovators. And we can change the narrative from them being stigmatized to positive disruptors. And I think that will also lead the charge in some of this conversation, Sarah, you asked with the question, because the disruptor is a mirror. I'll pause there just to see how that kind of resonates in people's synapse.
I loved the disruption over dysfunction piece. I loved it. I mean, so often we're willing to put up with dysfunction for the sake of, this is how it is done here. This is how we have always done it. This is the norm. This is, all the usual stuff. And in organizations, disruption is usually sought to be, if not suppressed, but kind of quickly polished over, kind of massaged away, and make peace quickly and move on. But what if disruption was, like Paul said, made a way of seeing things? What if the questions that we ask, or the questions leaders ask their teams, and the teams could ask their leaders, and the culture itself encouraged disruption actively, sought out disruption? Like, one seeks out innovation, but what does that really mean? A newer idea on top of the old one, which often ends up a little bit like the lipstick on a pig. But what would true disruption be? Radical disruption. But with tying it back to what Paul started out with, compassionate radical disruption, not disruption that is intended as malice, that is intended as just negative disruption for the sake of disrupting, but disruption that is compassionate, that is stemming from one's wholeness, that is stemming from, what I say, true source of one's being. Then I would say disruption becoming a way of organizational behavior, a way of organizational culture, can probably be one of the most powerful scripting of the new narrative, one of the powerful beginnings of scripting the new narrative, new narratives. Excuse me. Yeah.
I'm going to do a quite intuitive thing, which I don't always do on my live streams, but I think it's going to really add something to where we are. Is I've just done a very quick search, and this is really going to tell us where we are between the old world and the new world, okay? So if you look at that description of disruption, a disturbance or problems which interrupt an event, activity, or process, or radical change to an existing industry, market, or technological innovation. Now that number one for me, Sahana and Paul, that is a classic descriptor of the old world. What will stop the machine working at full efficiency, full optimization, full productivity, right? That's how we view a disruption in the old world. Something that's going to stop us doing exactly as we're doing at the fastest, quickest, highest output. And what we're talking about here, which I absolutely love, and this is my lens on this, how do we use disruption as a kaleidoscope?
Mm-hmm.
So actually, how do we look through disruption and look at the myriad of possibilities of positive, radical, thoughtful even, compassionate, as you shared, Paul, disruption, right? So how do we shift the narrative from one that's breaking the system to one that's going to actually help co-create the new system? I did not expect us to be looking through that lens today, and I love it.
Well, you know, one of the things Sahana said in her opening was, you know, leaders daring to break free of the matrix. And I want to focus on the word daring. So, you know, this concept of daring to think differently, daring to do something differently, is embodied in the first quality of my FIRE leadership methodology, which is fresh thinking. And again, it relies on an organization's leadership team and culture to create the conditions to have honest-based dialogue, where that kind of thinking, daring to think differently and acting differently is encouraged. So that's kind of almost evolving the organizational and leadership culture and the synapse within it. Right? So it's kind of it starts at that level where we reframe what we mean by this word, and then that reframing lays the groundwork for creating safety. Now, we've all heard psychological safety, and we've all kind of, you know, that, don't get me started on that. It's some great work in that area, but that's the latest buzzword on LinkedIn. But I keep talking about the fact, and this ties in to what we're talking about, in order to have psychological safety, you have to address the fact that the reason you don't have it is because you don't have trust in your environment. Now, let's take that concept of trust into what we're saying. Why don't we create a narrative, lean in all the CEOs that are listening to this from the VPs of HR, let's create a narrative where we have trust as our foundation, and we trust that by being disruptive, we're disrupting for the bigger cause of what we're here for, rather than just to throw the grenade in the room. We're disrupting, because no innovation can come without disruption. And in my research of thousands of everything around the world, no disruption could come without creating the environment so that you can think in a way that's different. You have to, that has to be put into the foundation before we even start. You know, I'm already at the end of this in terms of disruption is embedded into the way leaders are identified and recruited and onboarded and developed and assessed. I'm already at the point where Glassdoor has you know, every CEO's level of disruption is ranked. And guess what? That disruption is the distinguisher and the differentiator that allows them to make more money in a way that leverages new narratives. So again, pause there, just put that out, see how that resonates. Of course, I'd be a disruptor, wouldn't I, Gary? Of course I'd disrupt this.
Just going to bring Sarah in briefly, Sahana. We'd love to hear from you, just to acknowledge Sarah, who's still with us in the space virtually. From my background in screenwriting narrative work, disruption is simply change, and there's no story, nothing without change, so disruption is absolutely necessary. Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Lovely, a really lovely ad. I think, I'm sitting here thinking, like, could you imagine a situation where a senior leadership team, CEO, Chief People Officer, Chief Diversity Officer, the old world, C-suite, which will change over time towards self-management, etc., that will come. But we're currently trying to speak to these people in the traditional sort of setting to help co-create new narratives. Could you imagine a time, Sahana, in the next 6 to 12 months where the three of us are holding space for said executive team? Would they allow themselves 1 hour to be in this dialogue to see what could come out of it? Can you imagine a time that may emerge?
Yes. And I'm saying that with a lot of trust and faith in the stories that are emerging, because so I believe we are here as creators of these crucibles, containers, and just the very nature of the disruption that is happening around us, whether we like it or not. Planetary collapse, species extinction, fires, floods, furies, whatever else is happening. And I living in Asia, I mean, half of Asia is flooded. Okay? No, we've reached a point where these cannot be ignored, no matter how much we try to look away. We cannot keep on walking, looking away all our lives. So yes, the time is here. The time is now. Right here, right now, Garry, like you say. And I can totally imagine in the next 6 to 8 months, we are holding space for leaders, senior leaders, who will willingly come to this conversation and who will willingly put themselves through the pain of this journey. It's a painful journey. It's a journey of transformation. Breaking out of your cocoon to become a butterfly is not going to happen overnight. You'll become absolute goop first before we emerge. But there will be people who will come, who will put themselves through this pain, because the pain of staying in the old world will have already become greater than the pain of stepping into this unknown chasm, currently unknown chasm. And we don't even know if you leap over this chasm. We are right now inside the chasm, but the pain will drive leaders into this. And I believe we will be holding many such conversations.
I just want to pick up on this. It's so important. So important to me personally that and I thank you for bringing this in, Sahana. It could be very easy, and this is a really important point. We have to be super, super careful that this conversation centers the right people. We are part of a journey. We absolutely are. But there are communities all around the world that tend to take the brunt of our Western commercialization, our Western consumerist lifestyles, that are rarely in the room in this space. And I think, Sahana, we would agree that over time, we hope to build the trust and invite more and more of those people into this space with us. So we're co-creating with them the new narratives. Because what we have to really be careful that we don't do is co-opt or create new narratives in the West that we then try to fit onto the global South. Then we end up with exactly the same issues we have today for another 500 years, right? So I just want to put a little break in, because I think it's really important that we name that part of this journey. And I'm holding myself to account, which is why I wanted to stop there for a moment, to remind myself of that critical nature of where we're going with this. Is yes, we've got to do it within our context, but there's a bigger story. The bigger narrative is, how do we stop the harm on those communities many thousands of miles away from our shores as part of this journey. So I just wanted to put a little handbrake in as you pointed towards, Sahana, so thank you for that. I really appreciate that.
So, Garry, in terms of the question you asked, can I see a Chief People Officer, VP of HR, CEO in a space with us in that timeline? I absolutely can. And And I just wanted to reiterate something, if I didn't reiterate it at the beginning, that, one of the, I hold no blame to anyone that's been complicit in the matrix. And I mean, what I mean by that is, as I said with the original post that spurned this conversation, which is we all show up the way we show up. We make a decision every day before we leave the house. We brush our teeth, we look in the mirror, and we have so this is a practical thing we can ask ourselves every morning. If we're in the matrix and we're trying to weed ourselves off it, and we're trying to extract ourselves, it doesn't need to be cold turkey. We could do this gradually. So as an idea, if you wake up in the morning and you brush your teeth and you look in the mirror, ask yourself, am I still willing to play the game today? Yes or no? Simple question. All right, I am, because I've got a mortgage to pay. I've got 2 kids to feed. I've got a home that I'm building somewhere else. And I need money. Okay, so I understand where people are at. So here's the question I then ask you. What can I do? What one action can I take while still playing the game that will allow me to ensure that I live my values and congruent with my values and my purpose here? Just one thing, one small change. And I invite people into that space that we're creating in the next 6 to 12 months to do the same. And I would invite them in under the context and the pretext, rather, of the conversation being about what's the one thing you can do differently. But you don't eat an elephant in one go. You just bite-sized chunks. So when the chief people officer gets a report on his or her desk that in 6 to 12 months, about 50% of their workforce at a certain level is disengaged, starting to lower their productivity and about to leave, that might be the catalyst to have the conversation to get them into the space, because underpinning that is the deeper narratives that we've been talking about creating and co-creating. So I'm confident that once we get them into the space, we can start to help them see through different lenses. But it's all from a place of no judgment, no blame. But the one fundamental thing that costs nothing is honesty. Honest-based conversations that have a forward-moving intent.
Sahana, I want to offer you the last word, if I may, as we're on time. Unbelievably, that's what flow state's like. Actually, let's do a little round of check. I'd love for you maybe to have the last word following Paul, and then maybe if you can also check out with maybe something you've taken away or something you're thinking about differently as you go into your evening in India. And Paul, if you and I can do the same. So just a check out, just a bit of a follow-up from Paul, Sahana, and then a check out would be great. And we'll go Sahana, Paul, then myself.
I think I loved what Paul wrapped up with, because judgment got us nowhere. It will get us nowhere. We have all, when I say complicit in the matrix, so the matrix is almost invisible, right? It's all around us. We are all a part of it. We can't see it. We can't touch it and feel it. It's the narrative we've been born into and lived wherever we are on this planet. And to get out of it, as what is the one thing, when I ask myself, what is that one thing I can do every day to live my values? I still have to make a living. I have a family. I have an old parent. What is that one thing I can do? Can I ask myself every day, what is this what I'm doing? Am I doing it in alignment with my values? Or am I doing it in spite of my values? And if I have to do it, still do it, but do it with full acknowledgement of where I am on that piece of task or on that activity, so that I'm not deceiving myself. I'm not being pretentious with myself. And if we begin from there, then I think we can take it outward as well, till a moment comes when we can't pretend. And gradually, each one of us, it's a difficult journey, but when we start on this, if each one of us gradually start that journey, we will collectively arrive at a place that we can't maybe imagine as individuals, but it's a collective arising and arriving. So yeah, so that's my checkout as well. This is something that we have to do collectively. And thank you for this conversation, Paul and Garry. Thank you so much.
I think what I'm taking away from this narrative that we've had here is that we are role modeling the future that we want to see from our own perspectives, and the approaches that we're taking are kind of, they are genuine, they are congruent with who we are, or where we are at our points in our journey. And I think one of the things that I'm increasingly realizing is that we can't do this alone. And so I would love to have a situation where we've created global ecosystems where we can have these conversations and we can hold space for different diverse narratives in a way that keeps us moving forward and doesn't just navel gaze and keep us pontificating, but actually gets to the practical side of things too. Because I think that's where a lot of people eye roll and disengage when they hear conversations about wanting to change the narrative in the matrix and all of this, because we start experiencing it, we're defensive about it. And so I think we've all acknowledged that we're in the matrix. We've all acknowledged how we deal with that, and we're pioneering a different way of seeing the future. And so it will take time. And to your point, Sahana, not everybody is at the same point in the journey. But the 5 stages I mentioned earlier, from awareness to embodiment, doesn't matter where someone is on that journey.
Yeah.
Just join us.
Yeah.
And let's create this environment together. But thank you, Garry, for holding the space for us in this context. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul and Sahana. Thank you, Sarah, for joining, and anybody else that joined us as we went by today. It's not a surprise that the collectiveness was certainly one of my biggest takeaways, and really us practicing, modeling the vulnerability, not seeking to be right, exploring together through our very different contexts, right? We've got the UK, we've got Canada, we've got India, got India today. This is just 3 human beings, open-hearted, open-minded, willing to engage in this dialogue. Imagine 30, 50, 60, a million, a billion, being like, everybody's got the right to be part of as being human. That's what I'm also taking. The very fact we've been blessed to be on this planet living this experience of life means our voice matters. And how do we get more people into this dialogue? And I think community, so collective, community, whatever you want to call it, whatever label you want to put on it, please come and join us. Please get involved. We're not seeking to be right. Sahana and I are hoping to have many, many more dialogues like this. And who knows what happens in the future? In persons, virtual, who knows? But I just feel very full, very nourished. Thank you both. Thanks anyone else for watching or listening back. This is the way forward. It's critical. And I'm going to remember Paul's compassionate disruption. For me, I'm taking that into my evening, is how do we positively disrupt the status quo from a place of care, place of love, a place of desire to develop a more equitable and inclusive world. That's really where I'm at with it. So thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much for joining us. And Jennifer, joined too late, but the recording will be there. Do not worry. Thank you for popping along. And there'll be another dialogue with Sahana and myself tomorrow, alongside Tom van der Lubbe from Visi, and also Haluk from Latro, 2 self-managed, 2 self-organized companies. So yeah, let's get going. Let's keep these dialogues going. And Paul, let's keep in contact. I hope you 2 get connected offline, Sahana and Paul, and let's just build this out and see who wants to join us. Take care, everyone. have a great morning, great afternoon, great evening, and let's see what happens with the technology as we try and close out. And much love, everyone.